name is Mahesh Singh. I am the Senior Vice President of Product at Digite, and I have been in the industry for about 20 plus years with a lot of experience around requirements management, application lifecycle management, collaborative software development, and handling distributed teams. Today I welcome two panelists who are going to be the main speakers for the webinar. The first one is Bill Atterbury. Bill Atterbury is President of Atterbury Associates and was formerly Engineering Director at GTE and Convergys. Bill is a recognized subject matter in the subject matter expert in areas of project and process management, process improvement, CMMI, application lifecycle management, and ISO standards, and has got proven skills in technology, software development, and software processes. Besides being a great communicator, and I hope that you enjoy the talk that he will provide, and he will share his perspectives on the overall challenge that software teams face, not just for requirements management, but an overall end-to-end problem that we typically see the software teams face. The other panelist will be Nathan Reddy, who is the product owner for TraceCloud. Nathan comes with over 14 years of experience in the software industry and a tremendous amount of experience in working with a variety of requirements management tools, and obviously with TraceCloud, with which he's been closely associated since its inception. So with that, let me turn over the session to Bill. Bill, are you there?
Mahesh, and welcome everybody from wherever you are. Hopefully I can live up to Mahesh's billing there. We'll have to see how I do on that. I'm really not going to take up a lot of time. I think the main key is what we've got coming up. But let us take a look a little bit at some information that you're probably not going to be surprised by. Most of you probably know it already. If we go to the next slide. Basically, what the industry has been looking at is I don't know. We're going to get the next slide. Do I have the slide control?
We may need to go to the next slide.
Yes. Nothing like a little technical difficulties to start off the.
Oh, sorry about that.
What's there, and the slides will come out anyway. So I'll work on the slides here, or somebody will as we're going through. But basically, if you look at surveys done within the past really decade or so, and for those of us who are even older than that, this thing goes back into probably the history of the software industry. But the failure rate of projects is extremely high. Some of the recent studies will talk to 70% failure rates on projects. And failure is being described here as either projects that got canceled or projects that severely overran, underperformed. Some of our all favorite terms. We'll get something out the door sooner or later. And those numbers will range anywhere from 80% to 70% failure rates, which means if we were baseball players, we'd really be unemployed. It also means that the cost to companies and the cost to the industry is extremely high. Well, we're a couple ahead, but is extremely high. If you look at, there we go. I'm sorry, I think I got cut off there. If you take a look, you're looking at $200 billion cost from the British side of things in 2009. If you go all the way back to 1999, based off of a large U.S. study, it was $210 billion just in the U.S. alone. Now, those are $99. I don't have the conversion, but clearly we're talking about nine digits and one heck of a lot of money. And we're not talking about anything that's new. As I said when I started, these numbers probably aren't going to surprise you. And for those of you who've been around a few years, change the first two digits, and go back 20 years, and you're going to see the same rates, and you're going to see similar, cost values. It has been a very, very expensive process. If we go to the next slide, the other thing that these things have in common is that in all cases, the number one cause has to do with lack of understanding of scope. In other words, we don't understand the requirements. Now, when I get into some of my process pieces, the same is true for your process improvement activities. They also don't necessarily have clear definitions of scope, which will lead you to some, from a project standpoint, unrealistic, different expectations. Oddly enough, the second cause frequently is management. With apologies to any management who's on the phone, but again, if you go back to these studies that we referenced on the first page, that will rank number 2. In fact, one study went so far as to say, well, lack of scope is number 1, lack of management is number 2, which sets you up for unrealistic expectations, which was number 3. So I think they were, overkilling it just a bit. The other thing, of course, that's interesting here is that if you go back, and some of you may not even remember who Cooper-Schleifer is, they've since been bought out, but in a 1995 study that they did worldwide across 8 different countries, again, requirements were the number 1 reason projects failed, to the tune of, roughly 75%. So 3 out of 4 projects are failing because we don't have an effective requirements development management technique. So again, we're talking about something here that is not new. The other thing that I want to highlight, and I know we're not into necessarily methodologies, and some of you will approach development different ways, but this is not a technical problem. This is not a methodology problem. I don't care if you're trying to leverage Agile, whether you're working off of waterfall, object-oriented, whatever your methodology is, it really isn't going to matter if you haven't got the upfront piece complete. Let's go on to the next slide. If we take a look at the application lifecycle and what that represents, and as an organization, you're going to be doing these things. What we're going to focus on today is really in the upper left-hand corner. Call it portfolios, call it business analysis, call it requirements development, but it is what is it you're trying to build, and how do you get that documented and done so that the rest of the cycle, the rest of your processes are going to be effective. We're going to talk a little bit about the bottom couple of blue bars: requirements management, change management, and to some respect artifact management, although quite frankly, you could do a lot of this without any pieces of paper. As you're going to kind of see, is in today's world where we're dealing with web technologies and repositories in the cloud and whatnot, artifacts are really kind of nebulous. I certainly will caution people to avoid thinking of these things as hard copy documentation or anything like that. But it all fits within the framework of what your lifecycle development is going to look like, and everyone's going to have approached this a little bit differently, but everybody's going to have some element of these pieces within their lifecycle. The real key is over on the right, where it talks about communication, collaboration, and integration, and this is where I tend to see an awful lot of the failings. You'd be surprised the amount of over-the-wall approaches that we get into, or even just parochial views. One of the times Mahesh and I got together was when I was with Convergys, and we were basically involved with a analysis of requirements management. The business units wanted to go one way, the technology groups wanted to go another way, and my boss was kind enough to volunteer me to referee. But even as little as that, as far as what you're looking for, fundamental problem they were trying to solve was one of communication, collaboration, integration. Each of them had their own tool that they thought was the best for that, but we really had to go back and investigate, well, how do you collaborate? How do you tie all this together? So if we go to the next slide, what we're going to see is the keys for success here that you get within the requirements area really is with your user involvement. And I'm going to use user here in the large context. It's you've got your end user who's going to use whatever capability you're developing, but you've got users within your life cycle that you're going to need to incorporate. That you're going to want to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. The other thing that's key, and one of the major pieces of requirements that I feel are missed is a concept of operation. Too frequently we get tied into, well, here's the list of requirements, and not as much into, well, how is this thing going to be used? And this can apply on a small scale, but it can also apply on a very, very large scale. One of the probably the biggest project I ever was involved with was obviously with the government, with the GTE. But one of the problems that they had is they wrote requirement documents out the yin-yang. I mean, that's what the federal government likes to do. But in order to get everybody on the same page, what we actually developed was the concept of operations. How do you expect this thing to work? What do you want it to do? And talk as either use cases, user stories, prototypes, whatever you want to look at here, but have some idea of how this thing is going to work. And that will lead you down a collaboration path to where everybody kind of gets on the same level of understanding. So collaboration, in my mind, is probably the biggest key within the requirement success story. It's what I feel most of the industry kind of lacks that. And we can get into some more organizational change and whatnot if need be. Integration, again, it tends to be a little bit more internal. You obviously want the requirement to be understood by the various groups. But there's a powerful piece of this that also plays within the collaboration element, and that is the testability. And it's one of the things that people overlook when they're writing requirements, but also in leveraging that attribute of requirements. If you can write a requirement that you believe is testable, then you can turn around and you can write the test case. And if you take that test case back to the person who has the requirement, your user here in collaboration, you'll be amazed how much clarity you can get within the requirements. And in reality, it helps throughout the how mechanism. You do your requirements, you do your test cases at the same time, you get all of those approved, people understand what you're trying to develop. And it makes everybody's life simpler. Again, a great key into your concept of operations. The integration, the ability to get all this in is what your major cost benefit is. We'll talk about that in a minute. But from a corporate standpoint, this is where you're going to have your cost reduction. And if you really want to get the attention of the corporate executives on the need for this piece, you only need to get the cost benefits. Once you get the CFO's attention that, hey, we're reducing the cost of what it takes for us to develop product, you'd be amazed how much support you can get. So the CFO in this case is really a good friend within this process. And finally, you get to completeness, which if you've really done the first two, you'll wind up with fairly complete requirements. They'll be clear. They'll be concise. All the parties will understand them. They'll buy into them. They'll know what's happening. And then when you try and get your stakeholder agreements, it'll be pretty straightforward. And one of the things that you want to be able to do within these requirements, I think you're going to see in the product today, is in the stakeholder agreement, you want to be able to let them have views. As I said, the collaboration was role-based within that lifecycle model. And so, if you're able to group them together, whether it be by particular function, whether it be by a group, a particular stakeholder, or a function within a stakeholder, much easier for them to grasp what's going on, get a feeling that yes, you do understand what we're trying to build, and get those agreements moving forward. Let's go to the next. The first one is intuitively obvious, but you would think. However, think about in your own organizations, how much time do you spend discussing the requirements? Well, what do they really mean? Well, what if I did it this way? Well, what if it looked like that? Well, how am I really going to test this? If you're doing all of those discussions, then you really are having a very difficult time understanding what you're building. And I don't care what you're trying to build, whether it's software or a house. If you don't understand and can't agree upon what you're looking for, it's going to be very difficult to build something that the end product is what will meet the expectations. I think operational concepts here are key. If you can have that concept of operation, it's very easy for everybody to understand, from the end users all the way down, into your developers and your testers. And again, I think that means you got to be able to group the requirements and understand them, because a requirement, within the system may affect multiple users, may affect multiple threads. So if you can have that one requirement grouped into different things, everybody kind of sees how it impacts what they're doing. And as I said before, it probably is one of the more significant areas in working the company's bottom line. We talked about the example where you're trying to avoid competing tools, but also think of it not so much as competing as the cost of integrating across multiple tools and moving things around. Well, we put together the requirements here, we put together the operational concept there, then we move it over here, and development takes a look at it, then we move it over here, and test takes a look at it, because everybody's got their own tool. Well, there's a lot of integration associated with that. And the less integration that you can be generating, then the less cost that you're going to have. It also helps the analysis by paralysis, which is, everybody wants to get to development. Management always wants to know, well, when can we start building it? And the counter to that is, well, we haven't figured out exactly what it is. Now, again, I think some of the Agile approaches here helps. Although I'll point out that in dealing with one of the companies who's really, really good at Agile, they actually do a traditional use case requirements process. They have to be very good at it. But they use cases, they have meetings with their end users, and they basically pound the requirements down, kind of how we've described today. They set up the test cases. They have very specific, concise requirements. They do have some intermediaries that avoid the analysis paralysis, but they get the requirements done, and then they feed that into their Agile development cycle. And they produce products out every 6 weeks. At a very, very high quality. They have one of the lowest error rates that I've run across. Which gets us into the last thing, and rework is sometimes hard to gather, particularly cost on. You may not have good mechanisms on this, but if you're constantly redoing things, if you get the sense that you're recycling through things, then that's a cost of reworking, whether it be the code, whether it be the requirements, whether it comes through change control, whatever. Is going to be an expense within your development life cycle. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that other engineering disciplines have really changed how they do requirements. If you're looking at physical product, you have computer-aided design, graphical design capabilities that software hasn't yet incorporated and really needs to leverage that type of a capability. Some of you may not have noticed or read, there was a recent announcement, it was done by Boeing, I believe, where they have developed a brand new, I think it's called an automated plane. It's a fighter plane or a scout plane for the military without any requirements. And they did it, faster than they have developed any other plane before. Now it was 2 years, but in plane design, 2 years from concept to actually having a working plane is unheard of. They've never gone through any of that, and it has to do with their structured approach. They also leverage the prototyping in doing the requirements, and that can't be stressed enough if you can do those types of things. But you're really getting back into, well, how do I get to understand what I'm doing and get everybody on the same page? And that's really what I hope you see out of today's stuff, and really what kind of excites me about the product that we're going to hear. But it's the biggest area within the industry today, and has been. And it's about time that we take serious actions against it and try and get more effective in our development. Next, I believe, yes, is Sri.
So Bill, thanks very much for that. I must say that I have probably heard you speak about this subject more than a dozen times at least, and I think it's fascinating to hear you describe the situation and describe the overall problems the industry faces. It is just amazing to hear you talk about it in terms of the grasp you have on the subject. So clearly, what you're saying is that it's, at an overall level, it is not just a requirements management problem. It is really a problem of the entire discipline, from requirements all the way to code delivery and the interaction between various functions. But also, it's an organizational problem. It is not just IT. It is not just software engineering. It is also involvement of other functions, whether it is management, whether it is CFO. There is that requirement for the overall organization to contribute in a meaningful way in order to make sure that business objectives are met when software is delivered. So let me, since we are running slightly behind, I'm going to go ahead and straight away pass on control to Sri, and we will come back to question and answer. There are a few questions that are already in which are interesting based on what Bill just already talked about. So Sri, all yours.
Okay. Thank you, Mahesh and Bill for I would say very concise description of the problem. At this point, I'll go into details as the problems that you would see on a day-to-day basis, and what can a tool or a system or a process help you in managing them. If you look back at some of the projects you worked on, right, and the ones that specifically had trouble, you'll see some common issues. Ignore shared requirements for the time being. I'll come back to that. Probably the first problem you have seen is a case of requirements that were completely missed. That is, you delivered a project or a product, and the client came back and said, I didn't ask for this, or you did not give me what I asked for. Another problem you probably ran into is halfway through your project, stuff kept on changing on you. Your product manager came and made a request, your engineering team came and made another request, your client made a third request. While change is acceptable, the fact is, was the change properly analyzed? Was the impact of the change visible to everybody? And was the entire, I would say, not just the development team, but your QA team, every stakeholder involved in delivering that feature, were they aware of the change and did they internalize the change? That may not always happen, which leads to, of course, a problem at the end. Another problem you have is, we talked about management of a project as a big issue. It doesn't necessarily point to the project managers or the dev managers or QA managers. It points to a situation where you don't have enough visibility into what's going on the project. You may have visibility on a per requirement basis, that is, you dig deep enough and ask the right people, but you may not have a holistic view of how is the release coming along. Have we tested every single functional requirement in the release? Are all the business requirements we promised to your client, are they all being worked on in this release or not? These, you can get to an answer if you want to, if you look long and hard enough, but it's not easy to do it. And the last piece is, there's a concept called one throat to choke. It essentially means, well, there's one person who owns this requirement from a delivery perspective, and so it doesn't necessarily fall through the crack. and that person tracks the requirement from beginning to end. That's another concept that might be missing in some projects where you realize, oops, I thought person A was supposed to handle that, and looks like he wasn't aware of that. So those are some of the problems you might have seen. If you go back to the concept of shared requirement, which I skipped earlier, this is a pretty common scenario where if you're working on multiple projects, you want to drive some best practices, some compliance requirements, or you want to reuse the requirements that worked successfully in one project in other projects, right? So how do you handle that part of the problem? So these are some of the problems that we'll try to go into slightly more detail. Next slide, please. So is the simple answer to these problems to kind of buy an off-the-shelf requirements management solution and throw it on your users? And the answer is may not be. You may want to kind of think about it a little bit. You want a system, right, that lets you define your requirements, collaborate with everybody, manage, measure, and deliver on what you promised. However, there's a big caveat, right? If the solution you're putting in place, if it's not fast, if it's not secure, if it's not extremely user-friendly, if it's not scalable or affordable, you probably are adding just one more problem to the list of problems you have on your hand. And I'm speaking about this based on experience. I worked in a company in the past where we had the problems I mentioned about earlier. Then we went out to the market and brought this awesome market-leading tool into the company, and the tool was not scalable, it was not user-friendly, it was very expensive, and the users hated it. So the caveat here is look for a tool, but make sure it has, I would say, a user pull as opposed to a management push behind it. Anyway, going back to the earlier problems we talked about, what are the solutions? Well, you want to be able to define your requirements easily. You want to be able to make the relationship between different requirements visible to everybody. For example, if I'm a test engineer, I should be able to see the functional requirement that I'm going to test, the business requirement that led to it, and any kind of discussion and collaboration that happened all along the way during the existence of this particular requirement. One of the solutions to our change control problem is I need to make sure the right people have the read access, the right people can modify a requirement, or the right people can see the impact of the change before they request it. For example, if I touch this business requirement, it's going to impact 57 functional requirements, right? A kind of an extreme example. So I need to be able to control who can modify a requirement, and not only that, I may need an approval process to make sure, hey, it goes through a change control process so that I'm not asked to deliver stuff with a high quality while what I'm asked to deliver keeps on changing on a daily basis, right? And another piece is visibility. In most systems, visibility is treated as an afterthought. That is, yeah, we'll let you manage your requirements, but if you want to kind of get this holistic view of what's happening, you're kind of on your own. And we try to solve that. I'll go into more detail later. And make sure every requirement has an owner, and give those owners tools and systems so they can easily find the trouble spots. So next slide, please. What is TraceCloud from Digite? As I mentioned earlier, it's flexible. It comes as a SaaS solution or an on-site solution. It's lightweight and powerful. It doesn't really care whether you're using Agile or Waterfall. It supports both. And it's pretty feature rich. So if you look at the diagram below, it has a ton of stuff like word integration, traceability, dynamic documents, ability to baseline requirements. But you don't have to use all of them because they may not be relevant to what you do. So you could say, well, all I'm looking for is an online Excel file that users can collaborate and make change and relate requirements to one another and get a good dashboard visibility. And well, you have that. Sometime later you might come and say, this is good, but I would like to baseline my requirements as they stand on a certain day. So I can always go back to a source of truth, but you can do that too. So the idea here is you can pick and choose the pieces that are relevant to you. Okay. Next slide, please. Let's go back to the problems and a slight deep dive on how we can solve them. The first piece is, well, requirements were given to me. I was working on them. I delivered my project. And guess what? When the project got delivered, I missed some requirements. The industry term for this is called a dangling requirement. That is, if you have a business requirement, 50 of them, you're working on them in a release. If they don't have a corresponding functional requirement, it's considered to be dangling. That is, nobody's working on it downstream. Or alternatively, if I have 100 functional requirements that are going out in a release, if some of them don't get tested, that means they're dangling functional requirements. That is stuff that's going to the customer but has not been tested. And what you're looking at the screen, if you look at that vertical red box, is a column that says these are the dangling requirements in this particular release. And each row there, if you look at BR is business requirements, FR is functional requirements. This tells me there are 41 business requirements in this release that have a problem, that are dangling, whereas 84 functional requirements are also dangling. That is, 41 business requirements don't have an associated functional requirement, okay? And of all the functional requirements I have in the system, 84 of them have not been tested yet. And that's a pretty powerful ability to tell you where you stand. And by the way, each number is a clickable link. When you click on it, it shows you what those requirements and the trouble are. So this is a dashboard working at a release level. And slightly below that, you can see actually a trend chart that kind of shows you the same information, but shows you progression on a daily basis. So hopefully you know how you stand today compared to how you stood, say, a month ago. Next slide, please. Again, a deeper dive into that concept, which is not only do you get your, let's say, a table that tells you how you are doing on a per requirement type basis in each release, but you also get these reports. So you don't have to go ahead and become the master of this reporting system. It says, well, here is a set of canned reports by default. For example, in this particular slide, I'm looking at a project called TraceCloud development. If you look at the highlighted red box at the top, it says, get me my requirements in a project that are dangling. So I just click that. It gets me all the requirements in this project that don't have a downstream application. I can get that. I can take an Excel dump. I can email the report out and get the right people to work on it. Similarly, if you look at the other reports on this page, you can see, get me all the requirements that have changed after a certain date. Or get me all the requirements that are incomplete in this project, or get me all the requirements that are in approval workflow, that is, that have not been approved yet. So the idea here is there is a pretty rich built-in business intelligence system on top of a regular transactional requirements management system. Okay, next slide, please. And that's how you would solve your missed and misinterpreted requirements problem. Coming to change control. I remember somebody once said, change is the only constant. Right? I mean, we know that change is going to happen all the time, and that's the only constant that we know. So in your project, you probably know this. You start working on a project, the scope changes on you, requirement definition changes on you. Even within the project, the functional requirements written by the development team change, because as you kind of figure out more and more about the problem, you figure out your approach. So it's okay to change stuff in a project, but you want the right people to change it. You want that change to be approved by the right people, just so that you have some level of control. So what you're seeing on the screen here is, if you look at the second line, which says business requirements / sandbox, you can control what is in a folder by defining roles in a project and say members of this role can create, read, update, delete, trace, approve either the entire requirement or only certain attributes of this requirement. So you have that fine-grained control as to who can make the change, and once you are at a stable state, you can lock it down and say, well, that's it, no more changes, okay, till the project is done. Or you can lock down certain folders at a time, depending on what your project needs are. That's how you would manage your change in a project. Let's go to the next slide, please. I think we covered this one slide. Yeah, there you go. Change impact analysis, right? This is critical. That is, as we're going in the project, a client comes along and says, yeah, you know what we told you about earlier, we may want to change that a little bit. ideally, if you're a product manager, or if you're a development manager or a test manager, it would be awesome if you could kind of say, well, if you make this change, this requirement is linked to these 35 other requirements, and those 35 are linked to 50 others further down, and this is the one place you're making the change, but it's going to impact everybody else, and I may need to work with them to kind of propagate this change. And that's called a change impact analysis. And if you look at the screen closely, there's a button called CIA at the top. So every requirement in the system, by definition, comes with that ability. You just click on the link. It tells you this requirement is linked to requirements in other projects, other requirement types, and the other people who are working on implementing this requirement for the downstream. And these are all the people I will need to at least notify or talk to before figuring out the impact of this request. And that comes built into the system, and that solves the problem of analyzing the impact of a change in your project. Next slide, please.
So we just wanted to give you a heads up on time. We are about 10:40, so roughly about 10 to 15 minutes more.
Okay, I'll try to move it fast. I'll try to wrap it up in about 5 to 10 minutes. Change propagation, we talked about that, which is not only just the impact of a change before you make the change, but after you make the change, how do you know that everybody downstream and upstream have accepted the change? So for example, as a business requirement person, I modified a business requirement. Well, that's good, but how do I know that the engineering team has modified their requirements and the testing team has modified their requirements? And what you can do by building a quick trace tree is show this entire relationship chain and know where your change got stuck. Ideally, you want to see every arrow there to be green. If it's red, that means the handshake between you and the next requirement is broken. There is some flux out there that you want to get resolved really soon and really fast. Next slide, please. We talked about, I kind of gave you a brief overview of that data table that tells you, well, on a per release basis, what are the different requirement types you have, and are they dangling, are they orphan, are they completed or not? But if you take a step back, you'll realize that in any project, you can have different people with different hats and different motivations and different things they're looking for. For example, I could be looking at purely a folder and say, well, all my critical requirements are in this folder. I care only about that. Or somebody else in the same project, say a release manager, could be saying, hey, this is too much. What I'm looking for is the release that's coming out in December 2011. That's the only thing I'm tracking. Just show me the stuff relevant to that release. Or you could have a program manager that says, yeah, you know what, this project has 10 releases. I want the overall holistic view. And last but not the least is me, the developer, or me, the test manager, or me, the product owner, who's saying, hey, I don't care about the entire project or anybody else. I'm going to be selfish. I just want to know the stuff that has my name on it, because if I don't deliver the stuff, I'm in trouble. So let me get my own dashboard. And the takeaway here is we can slice and dice the same data multiple ways by clicking on a link and getting the dashboard for that role you're playing. Next slide, please. I'll try to move through this fast. We talked about this requirement ownership. That is, you get your own dashboard. Every user, when they log into the system, they get the dashboard that shows all the requirements that have their name attached to them and what's happening in the system from a progression perspective. Let's jump into shared requirements. 3 use cases here. For example, let's say one is drive compliance. Let's say you're building phones or you're building multiple software projects. You may have a need where you want to drive compliance across all these projects. That is, you want every ATM that you build, for example, has to comply with Americans with Disabilities Act. Or you want every software application you're building has to comply to common security guidelines or user interface standards. How do you do that? Second is, you're building a product. Let's say you're building a blade or a chip, or you're building a steering wheel for a car. It's used in multiple solutions. So you want the functional requirements of this piece of the puzzle that you have built tested and passed in every solution. So how do you reuse your requirements? The third concept is a slightly deeper concept. Is if you're building phones, for example, say Motorola, you have these different requirements that keep on coming along with you, and you want to release multiple phones at a really fast pace. How can you put your requirements management process, it's called product family engineering, in such a way that you can group your requirements into product families and deliver multiple products of this family on a regular basis, while kind of controlling your change and your baseline requirements. That is the third use case for shared requirements. Next slide, please. 3 pieces of the puzzle. And using TraceCloud, it's probably the only tool in the market that actually has this functionality, where you can take a set of requirements, you can baseline them, and publish that baseline out. So while you're working on the requirements, the published baseline doesn't change. Okay, next slide, please. Once you publish your baselines, different projects that are coming and implementing can come and say, hey, I'm building a phone. I would like to get the stable Android operating system requirements. I would like to get the stable Americans with Disabilities Act requirements. I would like to get the stable, say, FCC guidelines. And you get these different packages that have been published into your project, and you implement them. Next slide, please. There are 4 diagrams out here. The first one on the left tells you that even though you kind of have imported a requirement that has been published, there is a relationship that's maintained from your copy to the source requirement. The top right-hand slide tells you that you can always build a trace tree or do a change impact analysis that says, if you are to modify a requirement in your local project or in the published project, who are you impacting? The bottom left side image shows that now that these requirements are linked to one another in a traceability format, you can run reports like, say, show me the testing status of this requirement as it is implemented in multiple solutions. Another thing on the right says, well, there is this dashboard that gets built for you automatically that lets you drive compliance and progression. Next slide, please. There's this discussion that goes on that says, hey, I love Agile, and some people say, well, we landed a man on the moon using waterfall, right? But the thing I want you to take away from this is, irrespective of which process you use, this is what Bill referred to earlier, your underlying need to understand what you're building and managing what you're building doesn't really change. Okay, so what TraceCloud does is it has this beautiful marriage of your traditional requirements management needs with either Agile or waterfall. It doesn't really care. For example, let's go to the next slide, please. If you want to define sprints, you could use TraceCloud and say, well, I want to define a sprint. It's going to have a start date and an end date. It's going to have a Scrum Master, and it's going to kind of have some description and name. Next slide, please. Then what you could do is you could go into your backlog. That is, I want to treat all my business requirements or use cases as my backlog. I want to go to a specific folder, select all the requirements, and add the ones that I want to attack in this particular sprint into the sprint. So you can see that add sprint button, add to sprint button. So you're adding, I'm saying BR per 38, I would like to attack in the sprint, and you just add it to your sprint. Next slide, please. Once you add them to your backlog, and on a daily basis, you go through your Scrum call. And what this says is, for that particular sprint you're working about on the Scrum call, you see 4 columns of data out here: the gray, the yellow, the red, and the green. The gray are all the stories that you've pulled in that have not started yet. The yellow is the one that are in progress, that is somebody's working on them. The red are the blocked, and the green are the completed. So as your sprint moves along, you'll see everything starting out on the left with non-started. Some of them will move to yellow, some get blocked, and as things get completed, they move to red. And your goal on a daily basis to be make sure as many as possible in completed state, make sure very few are blocked, very few to none, unblock them as much as possible. And next slide, please. And you can see that the top bar of every one of these, you actually have numbers that tells you how many, I would say, requirements are in which state. You can actually define how much work effort is required and how much is left. So those numbers also get rolled up the chain, and you can track that progression. And the next slide tells you that, yeah, just like the dashboard we showed you earlier, where you can track things on a user, folder, release, project level, you can also track it on a per sprint basis. You get these dashboards that are built in that says, in this sprint there are 35 business requirements and 6 functional requirements, and this is what the progression is. And so next slide please, Mahesh. I think that should be the end of my part.
Thank you very much, Sri, and Bill. That was a great presentation. So we actually have quite a few questions. So let me start with a question that I think perhaps Bill can take, and Sri, of course, feel free to jump in as well. The question is, where is the main problem? Is it requirements elicitation? Is it requirements management? Is it managing the changes to requirements, or is it interaction with other disciplines? Where is the problem when it comes to just looking at the requirements management discipline alone?
That's a really good question, and it does vary somewhat. However, it really starts with the solicitation process and development process, and the reason it does is because if you have a good interaction, if you have a good mechanism for initially identifying what your user community, your stakeholders, again, user being the big U here, the stakeholders needing, and you have that communication and collaboration, you actually will find that change control and the management of the requirements is really pretty simple, and particularly if you have a tool like we're talking about today that's visible to everybody, so that you can help foster that communication. I think one of the things that Sri highlighted that I also wanted to point up in this area as well is that you pick what you want to use. This isn't about defining a new methodology. This is about refining processes that the organization has. So if you're looking from a process improvement standpoint, then I'm going to point you to, well, how do you get your requirements, and how effective is that process? And once that has been looked at and you made some improvements there, I think you'll find the other areas will be a little bit simpler, both to deal with, but also they'll have less impact on your organization.
Fantastic. Another question that is somewhat close to my heart, given the experience that we have with the customers trying to implement requirements management tools. A straightforward question, and Sri, perhaps you can take this. How do we move away from Microsoft Word? Users love Word and they want to continue to use Word. How does TraceCloud work with Microsoft Word?
Right. So I didn't get a chance to show you a screenshot on this, but what TraceCloud does is you can have a Word document that's a BRD or FRD. You put it in the TraceCloud system and then suck parts of the text out of the system Word document and make requirements out of it. Then what happens next step is, now you get the power of, I would say, a requirements management system to attach attributes to it, to control change, to kind of manage traceability and manage the requirement as an entity. But at the same time, you get the benefit of being able to regenerate the Word document with all the collateral you have built up in the system about that requirement. So to start with, you start with the BRD, put it in the system, use a tool that is in the system to create requirements out of it automatically, manage them, and then be able to regenerate the document back with more relevant and extra information about the requirement. So that is a very powerful and highly used functionality that the system provides.
Excellent. Another question that I kind of expected would come up in a presentation like this is the user says we use Scrum. However, getting to clear user stories requires a lot of upfront work. So what they're basically saying is that in order for well-defined and documented user stories, I need to first work upfront with other forms of the requirements documentation, whether it is being done in Word or other requirements tools. Is this normal? I mean, am I expected to manage my big chunks of requirements outside the system if I'm using a Agile tool, and then bring them into the Agile tool when I'm got down to the level of a user story? And can TraceCloud help here in terms of managing both requirements as well as user stories? I think you did talk a little bit about that during the presentation.
And this is the point that Bill and I were referring to earlier about collaboration, right? You don't want a scenario where the test teams are brought in towards the end after the requirements are defined in a huge big document. And what TraceCloud tries to do is, you could, in theory, right, have business requirements defined and make the test management people as give them read-only access or give them the ability to comment on those requirements, so they can watch the entire discussion that goes through in hardening that requirement, so that when you actually build your testing or development, you know the not just the letter of the requirement but the spirit of the requirement. And a collaborative tool like TraceCloud kind of makes that whole process that much easier.
Excellent. Another question that is around the integration, Sri, I think that's definitely for you, is can you integrate with other software engineering tools, especially in the area of testing and IDEs like Eclipse or Visual Studio?
Right. So you can. So TraceCloud comes with a full-fledged web services API. That is, anything you can do manually, you can do it programmatically. Okay. And we have some hooks into, for example, we do an awesome job of rolling up the testing status of a requirement. Let me just take a minute on this one, which is, if you go to your test manager right now and ask them what is the status of this release or a product, they'll say we have 500 test cases, 200 are passing and 10 are failing, remaining are pending. Beyond that, they have difficulty in quantifying that in terms of which features are impacted, or maybe they could do it one level up, but if you ask them to take it few levels up as to what are the high level features, they don't have that visibility. What TraceCloud does is it takes the testing status of your test case and test results and rolls it up the chain. It says, well, these functional requirements are failed testing because they are failed test cases. Well, these business requirements are failed testing because it has functional requirements which have failed testing, and it rolls the information out. So as a release manager or as a product manager, you also now get visibility into how your testing is progressing, as opposed to depending on your development manager to talk to your QA manager to get you back with a number, which doesn't really mean much to you. That's one part. The second part is you can hook this system to link to, say, Quality Center, for example, and say, well, my testing system is in Quality Center. I want to get the testing status from there and link it to my requirements in the requirements management system, so everybody has visibility into the progression of the testing without having to know too much about the testing system. Ramesh, hope that Mahesh answers the question.
Oh, absolutely. Another question that I guess we get all the time is, how is TraceCloud different in the way that it is made available to the end user? Is it on the SaaS? Can you get a version of it that's installed in-house in our servers?
Yes, and so the thing with TraceCloud is, one of the goals we had was to reduce TCO, total cost of ownership. So if you use the SaaS version, you're up and running in about 5 minutes, and the cost to you is minimal. You pay on a monthly basis. But there are some clients of ours who have large engineering systems that they want to expose. They would like to have it installed on site, and it comes with two models when you install on site. You pay on a per license basis, or you can pay on a subscription basis. So if you want, you don't have to pony up money for 100 licenses upfront. You could say, well, I want to start with 20 users. I want to pay on a per month basis, and I want to try it for a few months. And if I want, I'll kind of increase my number of licenses or number of duration. So you don't have to tie yourself up for anything.
Excellent. So I guess we will stop here. We're just about 2 minutes away from the end of the call. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of Digité. We are a pioneer in web-based collaborative products for distributed teams, and that's actually been our main strength in facilitating distributed teams to be able to work together on a variety of challenges around application lifecycle management. We are based out of Mountain View, California, with over 75 customers, 250,000 users around the world. And we provide products that are in the areas of Lean, Kanban, Agile, ALM, and project portfolio management. Digite was covered by Gartner in the ALM market scope for 2010, and we continue to hope to get better at that. We have some key customers listed here, and you will recognize customers and organizations across the spectrum from large to small IT services companies, corporate IT organizations, as well as ISVs that use all of the Digite products for managing various aspects of the overall application lifecycle management. I wanted to provide the contact information for any follow-up questions that you have regarding this webinar. The webinar slides will be mailed out to all the people who registered for the webinar and attended today. I would encourage you to reach out to us for any questions on the product side, and if you have questions related to requirements management as a process or as a discipline, you certainly can reach out to Bill Atterbury at is the Gmail address that is provided here. And there is a ton of information available both at TraceCloud.com as well as Digite.com that you'd certainly find useful for looking at your specific situation and for your particular needs. With that, I'd like to close the webinar today. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for attending the webinar today. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Sri.
Thanks, everybody.